Ever tried reading while jogging, cooking, or even juggling flaming torches? Yeah, it doesn't end well. But with audiobooks.com, you can conquer books without the circus act. Dive into over 450,000 titles, including more than 10,000 free ones. Get hooked on a bestseller, find your next obsession, or finally read that classic you've been avoiding since high school. And here's the inside scoop. Sign up today for a free 30-day trial and snag your first 3 audiobooks on the house. Sign up for your free trial at audiobooks.com/podcastfree today. That's audiobooks.com/podcastfree.
Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I am Kemper Donovan, and on this episode, we will be discussing an outlier of an Agatha Christie short story, and how, Manx Gold. I have been meaning to cover this one for a while now. I am so excited that the day is finally here. But before I get into Manx Gold, I'd like to deal with a little bit of housekeeping. It's one of my favorite things in the world to share some of your listener responses with the audience at large. And I had a number of interesting reactions to a number of episodes. I am going to start with the more recent episodes and work my way backwards in time here. Did you think I was done talking about The Secret of Chimneys? Of course I'm not, because you all are not. So here is a postscript to my Chimneys episode that I received from one of you. I was especially pleased to hear your visitation of The Secret of Chimneys a few days ago. Despite its many flaws, I've always had a soft spot for it. But one thing you did not mention, and that I've always found interesting, is that her fictional country of Czechoslovakia seems very much inspired by Serbia. The Serbia of the early 1900s, I mean. 2 points make me believe this. First, at the beginning of the century, the Serbian king Aleksandar Obrenović decided to marry a former lady-in-waiting of his mother's named Draga Masin. This was not well received. She was quite older than him and rumored to be sterile. People thought she was a seductress with the king wrapped around her finger. The interior minister even said to him, "Sire, you cannot marry her. She has been everyone's mistress, mine among the rest." Nonetheless, they married in 1900. 3 years later, a coup was organized to put Peter Karađorđević, another dynasty also claiming the Serbian throne, on the throne. King Alexander and Queen Draga were apparently shot in their bedchamber, mutilated, then thrown out a window/balcony for everyone to see. This happened 20 years before Chimneys was written, but the similarity in names led me to believe that 13 years young Agatha probably heard of it when it happened and remembered it as she was writing. And I'll pause for a moment to note that I think this listener must be right. I suspect it was the marriage in 1900 that she remembered hearing about when the family was abroad. That would be the royal intrigue that caused such a scandal and made her perk up her young ears. Christie's father died in 1901, and the family took frequent trips out of the country, I believe from about 1896 up to his death. So that checks out in terms of the chronology of Christie's life. The Queen Viraga of The Secret of Chimneys does seem to be based on the real-life Queen Draga, for example. I think that is undeniable. Going back to this listener's message. Second, there was in the 1910s a Serbian nationalist organization commonly known as the Black Hand. They were working toward the unification of a Great Serbia. Their most notable act was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which unfortunately was the spark that led to World War I. By the time she wrote Chimneys, only a decade had passed, so I cannot believe she would name her Czechoslovakian organization the Comrade of the Red Hand without it being a direct reference to the Black Hand. And I heartily concur with that point as well. I just neglected to mention it, so I wanted to share those interesting historical details with all of you. I will now move on to a reaction to my rankings episode with Dr. John Curran. Here's what one of you had to say. Hi, Kemper. I was listening to your latest podcast episode while I was also exploring the new AI chat that everyone is talking about, ChatGPT. And I wondered what a crowdsourced language model would determine as the best Christies, which the AI, of course, acknowledged was a subjective topic. Nonetheless, I got a chuckle from the list that came out as it mixes both some of All About Agatha's top and bottom rated episodes. See below. So here's what ChatGPT had to say about the best Christies. I'm reading now from the screenshot that this listener provided. I don't know of a definitive, universally accepted ranked list of Agatha Christie's works. Humph. However, many of her books are considered classics and have stood the test of time. Some of her most popular and critically acclaimed works include Murder on the Orient Express, And Then There Were None, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, The ABC Murders, Death on the Nile, Murder in Mesopotamia, The Big Four, The Hollow, Murder at the Vicarage, and finally, listeners, oh yes, The Secret of Chimneys. ChatGPT continues, it's worth noting that these lists can vary depending on the source and the criteria used for ranking. Also, Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple series are considered as some of her best works, and many of the books featuring these characters are considered as her top books. You can also check the bestseller list of Agatha Christie books of a particular country or website, which could give you an idea of the most popular books among readers. So that is what ChatGPT had to say. All in all, not bad, fairly impressive as these chatbots seem to be. This is why we're all getting such a kick out of them, I think, in recent weeks. Daunting as the idea of robot-generated language may be, but I love that the list starts out strong, right? I mean, it doesn't include Five Little Pigs, but that's fine. There are many humans who suffer under the same delusion that Five Little Pigs is not one of Agatha Christie's greatest works. But then to just include Murder in Mesopotamia, The Big Four, and The Secret of Chimneys, wow, woof. But I do love that Murder at the Vicarage gets in there. Apparently, ChatGPT finds Leonard Clement as charming as I do. Thank you for that, listener. And you thought the artificial intelligence debate was not going to infiltrate an Agatha Christie-themed podcast. Well, you thought wrong. Continuing with the reactions to my final State of the Rankings episode with Dr. Curran, back to what I suspect will be the eternally raging debate over Nemesis that took place in that episode, whether it is to be lauded as a work of literature, as I argued, or excoriated as a puzzle mystery, as Dr. Curran believes. Here is what I heard from one listener in the Curran camp. And FYI, this is a little spoilery as to Nemesis, so fast forward a minute or two if you haven't yet read Nemesis. Regarding Nemesis, while I do take into account that it could be taken as the parallel to Curtain as Miss Marple's last case, I agree with Mr. Curran that the story takes a long, winding road to revealing the truth. I also wonder why it has not been commented in the show that it is quite implausible that Clotilde would accept the dying request of Mr. Raphael to let Miss Marple stay, more than once, mind you, too, with her and her sisters at the scene of the murder of Verity, when she has tried to pin the crime to Mr. Raphael's son. Wouldn't alarm bells sound, and one would suspect that Miss Marple might be up to fishing out the dark secret you were holding? As such, I find the story quite unconvincing. It seems to work somehow, mainly because of the fantastic staging by the already dead Mr. Raphael, more than the ingenious insights by Miss Jane Marple. It read to me more as Mr. Raphael trying to affirm his suspicions of Clotilde through the work of Miss Marple. And I don't think I had ever made that precise point about Nemesis, but it's a fair criticism, or perhaps quibble, of the book. And here is what I heard from a listener in the Kemper camp of things. Dear Kemper, I hope you're well. Thank you for the fascinating series of discussions on ranking, which I'm very much enjoying. Of the diverse insights from you, your guests, and listeners, the issue that spoke to me most was the debate between you and John Curran on Nemesis. I've always thought of Nemesis as excellent, primarily because the motive for murder is unusual and it's rendered in such a moving, insightful, and memorable way. While Curran rightly identifies that the plot mechanics and credibility have many faults, the motive remains ingenious and is rendered with great care and nuance, thus contributing to the book's overall believability. The writing style has an unusual degree of interiority, and the meandering thoughts of Miss Marple contribute to the unique and somewhat unsettling atmosphere of the book, as she slowly deciphers the character of the murderer through feeling the despair that has spread from them into their surrounds. Christie conveys a depth of unhappiness and loneliness in the murderer in a way that is both chilling and empathetic. I felt that Christie spelled out clearly the sexual attraction between the murderer and victim as something significant and relevant, though I appreciated that at no point did it feel like Christie was judging the murderer negatively on the basis of same-sex attraction. That is to say, it seemed clear that Christie felt a similar motivation for murder could exist, regardless of the gender of those involved, as was shown in the plot for Sleeping Murder, because any relationship of unequal power can intertwine sex with a desire to control and dominate. I remember you and Catherine discussing these dynamics brilliantly in your episode on After the Funeral with regard to the potential for additional complexity in the relationship between... I'll redact that since I don't want to spoil After the Funeral in case you haven't read it, but if you've read it, you know who those two characters are. Overall, while the mechanics are flawed, for me, the motive elevates the plot of Nemesis. I fully agree with you that there is significantly more to appreciate in Christie's books than puzzle and plot. Her mysteries are multifaceted, and that is why they are usually so enjoyable to reread. Like you, I only realized the extent to which I believe this after undertaking some self-examination on why I regard Nemesis so highly. The endurance of her work owes a lot to character, atmosphere, insight into human nature and society, as well as humor, and many other books, though admittedly not so much in Nemesis. Memorable characters populate her work, from the dignified poverty of Miss Williams to the restless intellect of Miss Bulstrode, from the abject devotion of Gerda Christo to the desperate respectability of Miss Gilchrist, from the independent and complex Henrietta Savernake to the simple-minded and ruthless Jane Wilkinson. Clotilde Bradbury Scott takes her place for me among those that make an impression as characters I remember beyond the puzzle mystery, as archetypes of the human psyche. This is more explicit in Nemesis due to the analogy made with the three fates, but is also done subtly and consistently across many of her works, thus giving them a timeless quality. Thanks again for your podcast and sharing your wisdom and that of your guests and listeners, because it has helped me to understand and appreciate more fully why I love Christie so much. Oh, listener, you are singing my tune on so many different levels, which is why I quoted your long message in full. But I hope that many of you out there listening to this also appreciated what this listener had to say. I think there's a lot of value in this opinion that just so happens to coincide with mine. That's the prerogative of the host of a podcast. I get to read out at great length those views that coincide with mine. But in all seriousness, I really appreciate that thoughtful analysis of why Christie is as powerful an author as she is. I found it moving and quite helpful, and I hope you did too. All right, I have a reaction to my episode in conversation with friend of the podcast, Brad Friedman, regarding the new collection of Miss Marple short stories. Dear Kemper, I have just finished listening to your recent episode where you review the new anthology of Marple stories with Brad Friedman. I very much enjoyed the episode, as I do all your podcasts. And then she compliments me and Catherine. I will skip over that, lest I blush too much. As a classics teacher, I wanted to write to you in regards to the unraveling story. Please forgive me if you realized this as you read. I know you love the Greek myths, but if so, I was very surprised that you didn't mention it in your discussion. You and Brad Friedman were confused about where the story was set. You're right that it's not St. Mary Mead. It's Ithaca. If you're not familiar with Natalie Haynes, she is a classicist and comedian and writes fiction and nonfiction about ancient Greece and Rome. The Unraveling is her Christie version of the Odyssey. Mrs. Weaver is Penelope, Eric is Telemachus, and Martin is Odysseus himself. She has imagined a scenario where Penelope does not wait for Odysseus to return, but moves on with her life. I think the story deserves more credit in its novel choice to blend the two genres. The mention of pigs repeatedly, the use of an arrow as murder weapon, the dog recognizing his old master, Martin taking forever to come back from war, and Eric being a baby when his father left are all references to the Odyssey. Again, apologies if I'm preaching to the choir here and you decided to focus your analysis on other areas, but I had hoped part of your discussion would touch on the double homage that is Natalie's story. I so appreciate this message because that completely went over my head. I'm so embarrassed. I think that my 9th grade English teacher would have been quite ashamed of me because we read the Odyssey, in translation, of course, in full my freshman year of high school. I loved it. To this day, when I even just see the word dawn, it could be referring to a person. It doesn't even have to be referring to the beginning of the day. I automatically think rosy-fingered dawn. That epithet is just etched into my brain. The gray-eyed goddess Athena as well. So, of course, this is Natalie Haynes's spin on the Odyssey. And while I think my and Brad's critique as to the mystery elements of the story stands, this certainly adds a delicious layer to that story, and I think will enhance any reader's appreciation of what Natalie Haynes is doing. So thank you again for that information, listener. Very crucial to add that to our discussion of the new Marple collection. And then finally, I have a substantive note on Nemesis. This does not have to do with how we should rank or appreciate Nemesis. It's not about the ranking of Nemesis, but it's a finer point about the text itself. So it's really a response to the episode I co-hosted with friend of the podcast, Jamie Berntal Hooker, in which we analyzed the text. And this one, too, is a little spoilery. So if you haven't yet read Nemesis, fast forward a few minutes. All right, here goes. I do have a comment about an older episode where you discussed Nemesis, which I listened to again this weekend after being stuck at home. You mentioned a throwaway reference to Emlyn Price being colorblind. I think this might not be a throwaway reference, but a clue, and one possibly stuck in its time. A few weeks ago, I reread a Nio Marsh novel where the victim was colorblind. The novel explicitly states the victim would not have told anyone this because it's the kind of thing you wouldn't want known. But there was no explanation as to why that would be. I tried to look into if there was a stigma about colorblindness in the early 1940s when the book was written and set. I came up with very little other than being colorblind may have hindered any military service during the war. When the victim's condition is revealed, the other characters are shocked and insist that cannot be. The victim's colorblindness was not only responsible for almost killing someone else at the start of the novel, but also was a hindrance that led to the victim's murder. The implication was that people who are colorblind are prone to making mistakes, and it is a condition one would hide, especially a man. There is a great deal of sympathy for the victim once his condition is revealed. So, 25-ish years later, in Nemesis, when Emlyn Price says he's colorblind, I think we're supposed to take it as he is not reliable as a witness. Indeed, he mentions he thinks the figure who pushed the boulder is a man when it is actually a woman. Mistaking a woman for a man has nothing to do with colorblindness, but the condition is rarely depicted realistically in the media, according to the research I did. This is perhaps a stretch, as I will admit, but the subject was fresh in my mind. Even today, colorblind people still are excluded from many jobs, particularly in the military, despite them having the benefit of being able to see camouflaged objects under certain conditions. Very interesting treatise there on colorblindness and perceptions about colorblind people. It seems that there may be some latent ableism here in Emlyn Price as a colorblind person. This message also made me think of Little Miss Sunshine, when Paul Dano's character, who's a teenager and who has his heart set on, I believe, flying in the Air Force, being an Air Force pilot. He definitely wants to go into the military. And while they are in the last leg of their rambling road trip, he realizes that he's colorblind, which dashes all of his dreams for military service, and he freaks out. So this is something that persists to this day. And I had never thought about the depiction of Emlyn Price as colorblind in this way. And I think that's really interesting. So thank you for that, listener. Thank you to all of the listeners who had such interesting things to say. And I don't quote every single listener who reaches out to me. That doesn't mean if I didn't quote you that I didn't find you interesting and engaging. I love hearing from each and every one of you. So please keep those emails in particular coming. I find that the sustained long form communication one can have over email is by far the best quality communication that I have with you all. Social media is great, but it tends to be a bit more clipped, a bit more bite-sized. I do love my email, showing my age here. All right, we are now finally ready to move on to Manx Gold by Agatha Christie. For starters, what is Manx Gold? I'm so embarrassed to admit how little I knew about the Isle of Man and the Manx people and culture before researching this episode. I didn't even know, for instance, that the word Manx refers to those who live on the Isle of Man, as in a Manx person is one who hails from the Isle of Man. So Manx gold is treasure to be found on the Isle of Man. And that is exactly what we have here. A treasure hunt in a specific location meant to take place in real life and real time. This is why this episode is an appropriate one to follow my live game experience of 2 weeks ago, as much as I don't want to remind you of my shocking defeat where that game was concerned. So let's talk a little bit about the Isle of Man before diving into the treasure hunt in question. I also really shouldn't admit this, but until doing this episode, I could never keep it straight which was the Isle of Man and which the Isle of Wight. I know. I'm sure my UK listeners are wincing right now because these are two very different islands. The Isle of Wight is to the south of England and very close to the southern coast of England, and it is unequivocally a part of England, a lovely vacation island from what I understand. The Isle of Man is a much trickier proposition. So the Isle of Man is pretty much right smack in the middle of the Irish Sea, which means it's to the west of England, the south of Scotland, the north of Wales, and the east of Northern Ireland and Ireland. It's not that far from any of these places, but it's not terribly close to any of these places either. And I suspect that has a lot to do with why the Isle of Man has such a distinct culture and history. It has its own language, for one. The Manx people do speak English. They also speak Manx. And most shockingly to me as I researched this, the Isle of Man isn't technically part of the United Kingdom. The UK represents it in international matters, though even this seems to be changing. But when it comes to domestic matters, the Isle of Man is an autonomous entity with its own parliament. In fact, its parliament, which is called Tynwald, is said to be the oldest continuous parliament in the world. It celebrated its millennium in 1979, although apparently the starting date of 979 was chosen at random with no evidence to back it up, but it's super, super old. I'm going to stop there because I'm by no means an expert on the Isle of Man, as you can tell, and I don't want to embarrass myself here. But I hope this gives a little context for why the leaders of the Isle of Man would reach out to Agatha Christie in 1929 to boost tourism on this island. Agatha Christie accepted this request for a mere £60, though let's note that £60 is worth £5,000 today, or approximately 6,000 US dollars. Part of me wonders if Christie was inclined to say yes to this tourist endeavor due to her experience on her round the world trip, which didn't have to do with tourism per se, but it had to do with getting various outposts within the British Empire on board for an exhibition to be taking place in a few years' time. So the whole endeavor was adjacent to the world of tourism. And we know that she took great delight in how ridiculous a lot of the aspects of that round the world tour were. And she really just had such a good time with her first husband, Archie, when she was on it. I'd also just like to point out where Agatha Christie was in her career and her personal life when she agreed to this request. In 1929, she had divorced her first husband, Archie Christie, and she had not yet remarried. This was soon after that period where she had been forced to churn out the mystery of the Blue Train because she needed the money, and she was horrified by that creative process and very interested in never feeling hard up for money ever again. So I have to imagine that when offers like these came knocking in this period, she was perhaps a little more likely to accept them than she may have been even just a few years later in the 1930s when she had established herself as such a surefire hit when it came to her mystery novels. So perhaps this offer came exactly at the right time, but we will never know exactly why she accepted. We do know that she did. And the result is that we have a very curious situation here because unlike most of Agatha Christie's stories, this story is not meant to stand on its own. It's meant to be consumed while engaging in an actual treasure hunt on the Isle of Man in real time. It's no wonder the story doesn't get read very much. And I have to admit, having just read it myself, it's an extremely stilted experience. I had never read this story before. I think only a Christie completist is going to bother to read this one because it really is an oddity. This story doesn't even appear in the short story index inside Robert Barnard's A Talent to Deceive. Janet Morgan and Laura Thompson don't mention it in their biographies. As far as I can tell, it doesn't appear in any of my good friend Mark Aldridge's books. And yes, Mark's first book has to do with film and television adaptations, of which there are 0 for this story. And his second book is focused on Poirot. But you'd be surprised at how many outlier stories having nothing to do with film and TV and Poirot Mark manages to reference in his 2 books, but nary a reference to Manx Gold. And I think the dearth of reference material on this story just speaks to its outlier status and its weirdo provenance. So let's talk a little bit more about that provenance and get into publication history. I'll speak about the initial publication in a moment, but the story wasn't collected in book form till much later than it was initially published. It appears in While the Light Lasts and Other Stories in the UK, which came out in 1997 via HarperCollins, and in the Harlequin Tea Set and Other Stories in the US, which also came out in 1997 via G.P. Putnam's Sons. I read this story as part of the While the Light Lasts collection, which excellent book includes detailed notes by my good friend Tony Medower. And I think his notes are probably the most detailed when it comes to this story because there's a lot to discuss. So I am just going to quote from Tony about the book's initial publication. Here's what he has to say. In the winter of 1929, Alderman Arthur B. Crookall had a novel idea. Crookall was the chairman of the June Effort, a committee responsible for boosting tourism to the Isle of Man. And his idea was that there should be a treasure hunt inspired by the many legends of Manx smugglers and their long-forgotten hoards of booty. There would be real treasure hidden about the island and clues to its location concealed in the framework of a detective story. Initially, some members of the committee expressed reservations about Crookall's proposal, but it was eventually endorsed. The committee agreed that the Isle of Man treasure hunt scheme should take place at the start of the holiday season and run at the same time as the International Tourist Trophy motorcycle races, then in their 24th year, and alongside other annual events such as the Crowning of the Rose Queen and the Midnight Yacht Race. Feels like we're very much in Agatha Christie country fate territory here, doesn't it? Back to Tony. But Crookall had to find someone to write the story around which the hunt would be based. Who better than Agatha Christie? Perhaps surprisingly, and for a fee of only £60, Christie accepted this, her most unusual commission. She visited the Isle of Man at the end of April 1930, staying as the guest of the Lieutenant Governor of the island before returning to Devon where her daughter was ill. Christie and Crookall spent several days discussing the treasure hunt and visited various sites in order to decide where the treasure should be hidden and how the clues should be composed. The resulting story, Manx Gold, was published in 5 installments towards the end of May by the Daily Dispatch. The Dispatch was published in Manchester and had been selected by the committee presumably because it was felt to be the newspaper that potential English visitors to the island were most likely to see. Manx Gold was also reprinted in booklet form, and 250,000 copies were distributed to guest houses and hotels across the island. The 5 clues were published separately, and these clues are actually pasted into the text of Manx Gold within the While the Light Lasts collection, so that we really get a full sense of the material available here from Agatha Christie when it came to this treasure hunt story. So this treasure hunt was happening in the summer of 1930. That is the period of time in real life when people were meant to use this text to find real treasure that had been buried in various places on the Isle of Man in the Irish Sea. Super, super weird, super, super fun. All right, let's talk about our victims because we have a few different victims here. In a weird way, our primary victims are not murder victims, even though we do have a murder victim in this story. These primary victims would be Juan Farraker and Fenella Mile-Carrain. And let's just stop a moment here, listeners, and address a topic that has bedeviled me so many times on this podcast. These are Manx names, people, and Manx names are not easy to pronounce. I actually had a Manx listener write in to give me a heads up about this first name here, Juan, which is spelled Juan. He kindly let me know that it's pronounced Juan and not Juan, as is definitely my first inclination, living in Spanish language infused Los Angeles, as I do. Not that we don't mangle the Spanish language left and right here in LA. Just take a trip down La Cienega or Sepulveda Boulevards, if you don't believe me. I told this listener that I like to think I would have realized this from the fact that Byron's Don Juan is so pronounced, but let's be honest, I can always use the help when it comes to pronunciation of British proper nouns. And for that reason, I'm just going to say, let's not turn this into another Bovril debacle. I'm going to try my best here. I will even bet that there are many of you in the UK who aren't sure how to pronounce these Manx names. As I'm saying the word Manx, I'm even now worrying that that is not how you pronounce that word. I sincerely hope it's not monks or something like that. I'm just going to go with Manx. Have pity on me. So Juan Farraker and Fenella Mile-Carrain it is. Juan and Fenella are victims in that it's pretty clear they're the ones who should be inheriting all of their deceased Uncle Miles's personal wealth. They're good eggs. They're his nearest relatives. But instead of just giving his inheritance to them, crotchety old Uncle Miles has devised a treasure hunt whereby they have to fight for the right to their inheritance with 2 other unscrupulous distant relatives. Poor Juan and Fenella. Our murder victim turns out to be one of those other unscrupulous relatives. That would be Ewan Corjeag, Corjeag. Yeah. Very unusual last name. Ewan dies quite brutally by way of a massive head wound caused by a jagged stone, though the logistics of how this head wound came to be are unclear. More on that later. We don't have many suspects. First up is Mrs. Skillicorn, the housekeeper at Moggold House, which is the former residence of Uncle Miles. Mrs. Skillicorn is none too pleased about all this treasure hunt nonsense. She's neither a source of fun nor help, maybe because she's involved somehow. And our second suspect is Dr. Fayl, Fayll. He is the fourth distant relative of Juin and Fenella's, a tall, fair man with a florid face who no one trusts. And that is it. I've already alluded to the fact that this is an unconventional story. Even though we do have a ton of clues, they're treasure hunt clues, as opposed to the clues we're used to coming across in a traditional puzzle mystery, bridging us over from the world as it appears to be to the world as it actually is. So I am now going to dispense with our usual breakdown and merely describe to you the world of the Isle of Man. And in particular, this kooky treasure hunt that is taking place here in the summer of 1930, as aided by Agatha Christie's chronicling of the fictional treasure hunt that takes place within these pages. So we open on the Manx lad Juin Farraker singing the praises of his first cousin, Fenella Milacrane, who's just finished singing an old Manx ballad about the grandfather of their old Uncle Miles. And it seems this ancestor hid a treasure somewhere on the Isle of Man, and to this day, no one knows where. I also love how Juin just casually mentions, she is my first cousin and also, from time to time, my fiancé. Come again, Juin? Though let's never forget the fact that Christie's mother was kind of sort of an adoptive stepsister to Christie's father, or that Christie didn't really shy away from kissing cousins. She featured them in her very first published novel, The Mysterious Affair at Styles. Different times. Anyway, Juin and Fenella are broke, which is why they're only engaged from time to time. As Juin puts it, in moods of financial optimism, we are engaged. When a corresponding wave of pessimism sweeps over us and we realize that we shall not be able to marry for at least 10 years, we break it off. So we are in charming first-person male narrator territory here, people. Think Leonard Clement from The Murder at the Vicarage. Think Captain Hastings from any number of Poirot stories. Think Jerry Burton from The Moving Finger. I definitely thought of Jerry in particular, as Juin was waxing poetic about his beloved cousin's finer qualities. I suppose that isn't fair because I think it means the poison pen letter unfairly insinuating that Jerry and Joanna were romantically involved has somehow seeped into my consciousness. Such is the power of gossip. We're also, of course, in larky adventure thriller territory here. Juin and Fenella's penurious state feels very much like that of Tommy and Tuppence at the beginning of The Secret Adversary. The Christie canon is littered with romantic heroes and heroines from the 1920s, bursting with spunk and chutzpah and whatever else you want to call it. I'm thinking Bobby Jones and Frankie Derwent from Why Didn't They Ask Evans? I'm thinking Anne Bedingfeld and the titular man in the brown suit from The Man in the Brown Suit, etc., etc. And wouldn't you know that in the very moment they're discussing this lost treasure, Juin and Fenella receive a notification of Uncle Miles's death. The letter is from a firm of lawyers in Douglas, which is the capital of and largest town in the Isle of Man. And it states that they've jointly inherited their uncle's house in Douglas and, quote, an infinitesimal income. Looking gift horses in the mouth much, Juin? But there's a second letter enclosed from Uncle Miles himself, in which he informs them that he actually located that long-lost treasure of his grandfather's, which he has now secreted into 4 newfangled treasure chests, quote, in a more modern form than gold ingots or coins, end quote. It seems there are to be 4 competitors for this treasure. Juin and Fenella, plus their other cousin, Ewan Corgiag, and yet another cousin named Dr. Fayl. Ewan is a known nightmare, and Uncle Miles suspects that Dr. Fayl is no better. He has little hope that Juin and Fenella will win, since goodness and innocence are seldom rewarded in this world. Even so, Uncle Miles has tipped the scales in their favor slightly by notifying them of this game they're about to embark on a full 24 hours ahead of their 2 cousins. So what's going to happen is when they get to the Isle of Man and show up at his old house, now their house in Douglas, they will get their first series of clues leading them to the first of these 4 treasures. The clues for the second treasure won't be released till the first treasure is found, which means the chase for each of these 4 treasures starts afresh. In this way, it's possible for one of the 4 to find all 4 treasures, for each of them to find one apiece, or anything in between. The wily Uncle Miles ends his letter, "Good luck to you both, but with little hopes of your success." To which Fenella responds with a big F that. Or as she puts it, how dare he say we were good and innocent and stupid? I'll show him. Jewin, we're going to find all 4 of these chests and get married and live happily ever afterwards with Rolls Royces and footmen and marble baths. But we must get to the Isle of Man at once. So the stage has been set, and I will be honest, as is often the case with Christie stories, this one starts with quite a bang. It's a super fun setup. What a lark. I'm very much put in mind of the rompy Miss Marple short story Strange Jest, which she wrote after this story, actually. That's a personal favorite of mine. It's another treasure hunt. We also have the Poirot short story, The Case of the Missing Will, which she wrote before this one, as well as the Tommy and Tuppence short story, The Red House. Technically, I should say The Clergyman's Daughter and The Red House, since those 2 chapters within the Partners in Crime collection form a single short story. But that too features a very kooky treasure hunt situation. Christie did this sort of oddball relative leaves weird will / instructions leading to a potential fortune for likable young things to suss out many times over, and to good effect. It's just that she's hamstrung on the page here by the fact that this isn't a proper story. It's a roadmap to a treasure hunt meant to take place in parallel with the reading of this story. So the setup is really the best part here. But let's keep going. Jewin and Fenella fly to Douglas, where they meet up with the grim-faced Mrs. Skillicorn, who gives them the first clue. 4 points of the compass, so there be, S and W, N and E. East winds are bad for man and beast. Go south and west and north, not east. And they're like, oh, they got nothing. I know the feeling, Jewin and Fenella. Mrs. Skillicorn is no help. Until she is help, actually, because in answer to a question from Fenella about whether anything's gone missing recently, she informs them that there are 4 snuff boxes that are no longer around. So Jewin and Fenella surmise that the 4 treasures must be hidden in these snuff boxes. And as my good friend John Curran notes, Cards on the Table, first published in 1936, so just a half dozen years after this story, opens with an exhibition of snuff boxes. Anyway, Jewin and Fenella find another clue in their uncle's desk, which is a map with some odd markings on it. There's a circle with 6 sort of hash marks on one side of it and a weird little cross in one corner. It's all very bizarre. This is one of those clues that was published separately from the 5 installments of the story. Then they have some supper, followed by a massive jug of coffee at Fenella's request, and settle in for an evening of puzzling over these clues. To help them, they refer to, quote, several excellent maps, various guidebooks descriptive of the island, a book on folklore, and a book on the history of the island. And they consume all this reference material. And Tony Medawar actually mentions this in his foreword to the story, that treasure seekers who came to the Isle of Man to partake of this treasure hunt were likewise advised to seek out the same reference material, which would help them in their treasure hunt. Talk about a mystery requiring material outside the text, right? And special knowledge of certain things, which is very much breaking one of the fundamental rules of reading a mystery. And I point this out just to drive the point home once again that we are really not reading a mystery story. We are reading an aid to a treasure hunt. It's very frustrating because I did not seek out those reference materials and I did not fly to the Isle of Man, alas, because I was not alive in the summer of 1930. In all seriousness, though, this really did make me feel hopeless and passive as a reader. This story simply is not meant to be read in 2023 in Los Angeles while lying in bed. But oh well. It's still something Agatha Christie wrote, so I am going to stick with it, and I suspect you will stick with it as well. Jewin and Fenella eventually figure out how to use these clues to find the first treasure. Christie, though, cannot describe how they apply these clues to find the treasure because, of course, she wanted people to do this for themselves. So rather than explaining how they did it, she merely tells us that they did find the first snuff box, which is an antique snuff box, seemingly worth a lot of money. And that after they find this snuff box, they run back to Moggold House for the clues to the second box. Fortunately, we have Tony Medawar, who in his afterword to this story within the While the Light Lasts collection, does describe how the physical clues can be used in conjunction with textual references Christie makes to real-world landmarks on the Isle of Man to figure out where these treasures are hiding. Apparently, they really were snuff boxes. They were the size of matchboxes. So these are very tiny snuff boxes we're talking about here. And per Tony, they contained an 18th century Manx halfpenny, which had a hole in it through which was tied a length of colored ribbon. And once the snuff box was handed in to the clerk of the town hall in Douglas, the winner would receive £100, which in 1930 is the equivalent to over 8,000 pounds today, or approximately 10,000 US dollars. Not too shabby. Interestingly, they also had to bring proof of identity since only tourists could win. As Tony writes, Manx residents were debarred. So I'm not going to go through the solutions to each of these clues because I will be honest with you, I found these solutions to be as convoluted and hard to follow as the clues deployed by the hunt-a-killer people in The Mystery of Hunter's Lodge. He said, not bitterly. Not that they involved rocket science, they were just quite involved. For one of the clues, the reader has to pick out the second word of several lines of verse Christie included in the short story, and this spells out a secret message: 85 paces east-northeast of Sacred Circle, Spanish Head. Then the treasure seeker has to figure out that the sacred circle in question is, I'm quoting Tony now, Meal Circle on Mole Hill, a megalithic monument a little over a mile from Spanish Head, the most southerly point of the island. Sure. Another clue involved extracting the sixth and seventh word of another series of lines of verse. There was a cover letter to this little ditty included in the text, which used the phrase all sixes and sevens. That was the clue to extract the sixth and seventh word. When extracted, this secret message reads out, you'll see point of A near the lighthouse, a wall. The point of A is the point of Ayr, another location on the Isle of Man. And then there was a wall in the vicinity of the point of Ayr, which did not contain the treasure. Oh no. Instead, it contained a stone that had 4 figures scrawled on it, 2, 5, 6, and 9. And when applying those numbers to the first line of verse, it gave the treasure seeker the 4-letter word park. Now, apparently, there is only one real park on the whole of the Isle of Man in Ramsey, and it was somewhere within this park that the treasure was secreted. Apparently, within this park, there was another wall, and that was the hiding place of the actual treasure. I mean, I never would have found any of these treasures, listeners. And in fact, that last set of clues had to do with the 4th and final treasure of the 4 treasures secreted on the Isle of Man. People did find the first 2 treasures using the short story and the clues published separately. Someone also found the 3rd treasure, but by accident, which I think is hysterical. And this 4th treasure, glued with 6s and 7s and whatnot, was never found. That actually had to be lifted out of its hiding spot by the mayor of Douglas. That happened on the 10th of July, 1930, quoting from Tony yet again, at the end of the extended period allowed for the hunt, which had originally been intended to finish at the end of June. So perhaps I shouldn't feel so bad that I would have made such a mess of this treasure hunt. And I'm not surprised that Agatha Christie seems to have made it way too hard. Tony goes into much more detail about the solving of these physical treasure hunt clues if you are interested in While the Light Lasts. But I am going to leave it there and return to Christie's story because, fortunately, the framing story around this treasure hunt is a bit more entertaining than describing the treasure hunt. It's certainly more Christie-esque. When we last left Juin and Fenella, they had just rushed back to Moghold House for the second series of clues. And at this point, they run into their distant cousin, Dr. Fail, who Juin despises on sight. But the 4th competitor, Ewan Korjiag, is nowhere to be seen. Dr. Fail tells Juin and Fenella to rest up. He says he'll find Ewan and get in touch with them so they can all meet up to access the second series of clues and hunt for the second treasure. The good doctor ends up calling them late that night, and he says that he and Ewan will come over to the house at 10 o'clock the next morning. But wouldn't you know, when morning comes, the house has been broken into, and the only thing missing is, you guessed it, the second set of clues to the second treasure, which Mrs. Skillicorn was going to give to all 4 treasure seekers. It seems, of course, that Dr. Fail and Ewan Korjiag have double-crossed them, but no sooner have they learned this than they hear a groan from outside the house. And they rush outside where a dark, youngish man is lying beside a fallen ladder in a pool of blood. Jewin sends for a doctor because it's clear this man is dying. And it also becomes quite clear that this is cousin Ewan, who regains consciousness long enough to say, "Fell from ladder." Then he passes out again, and Jewin notices a large jagged stone nearby, which is stained with blood, and he surmises that the ladder slipped. Ewan must have placed it on the front of the house because he was trying to break in and steal the clues, and Ewan fell off the ladder, hitting his head on the stone. But Fenella isn't so sure. A couple of hours later, and poor Ewan is in his death throes, but since this is a thrillerish Agatha Christie story, he has a few final cryptic words to mutter, namely, "Do you want the clue? I'm done. Don't let fail do you down." Fennell says, yes, they would like the clue. And he responds, "Do you ken?" And then he dies. I'm not even going to go into the clue of "do you ken," although it's noted soon afterward that Ewan is not Scottish. So he's presumably not using the word ken to mean no, the way that Scottish people do. It turns out he's quoting from yet another poem. Ah, yes, more dreaded verse in this story. But anyway, in the aftermath of all this, Fenella makes the excellent observation that if Ewan's death was purely an accident, then where are the clues he was stealing when he was using this ladder to break into the house? We get the sense, by the way, that Fenella is definitely the tuppence of the pair, i.e. the one with the brains. Fenella thinks someone must have jerked the ladder away and smashed poor Ewan's head with the stone on purpose. She even finds the impression the stone had made in its original resting place, which was quite far away from the house. So this looks like murder to her. And quite unusually for an Agatha Christie story, there is zero mystery as to who the murderer is. Mrs. Skillicorn is not a real suspect. By process of elimination, it has to be Dr. Fail, and in the end, it is Dr. Fail. Boo, hiss. But Jewin and Fenella do nothing about this for quite some time. First, they focus on finding that second treasure with their partial set of clues. Ewan also had a fragment of photo grasped in his hand, because of course he did. Fenella manages to figure it out. They find the second treasure, and then one day later, they have to meet up with Dr. Fail, who claims that he was sent on a wild goose chase, and that it was Ewan who misled him. And that's why they haven't seen anything of him till now. He is shocked and horrified by Ewan's death, of course. So now Jewin, Fenella, and Dr. Fail are present for the unveiling of the third set of clues, which were deposited with lawyers. And Jewin and Fenella are forced to ferret out this third treasure in the immediate vicinity of Dr. Fail. Though, once again, through Fenella's rather tuppence-like ingenuity, they find their way to the solution and the third snuff box. The set of clues for the fourth treasure gets sent to them by post a day or two later. Christie is vague on the timing here. And it ends up taking them nearly a week to solve this fourth set of clues. But first, they do manage to remember that their distant cousin is a murderer who needs to be brought to justice. So they lure the doctor to follow them when they're supposedly on the precipice of unearthing this fourth treasure, at which point he brandishes a revolver at them and demands that they hand over the treasure. He also conveniently confesses to having killed Ewan and to his intention to kill the two of them now, even going so far as to shoot at them, or as Christie puts it in one of her most thriller-esque descriptions, his revolver barked loudly. We are so in Partners in Crime, Tommy and Tuppence hijinks land here. Naturally, uniformed men spring out and he's dragged off, which leaves Fenella free to explain to Jewin, but not the reader, where they will find the fourth and final treasure, which they do the very next day. And our story ends with the happy ending we all knew was coming. "Eureka," said Fenella softly, "the fourth snuff box. We've got them all. Uncle Miles would be pleased. And now?" "Now," I said, "we can be married and live together happily ever afterwards." "We'll live in the Isle of Man," said Fenella. "On Manx gold," I said, and laughed aloud for sheer happiness. The end. Don't touch that dial. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of our episode. We just wanted to take a moment to ask you, our dear listeners, for a favor.
If you haven't already done so, we would very much appreciate it if you take a moment to, give us a rating or a review wherever you're listening to this podcast.
It really helps the podcast out because ratings and reviews make it much easier for other Christie fans such as yourselves to find our podcast.
And the more ratings and reviews we get, the more people we can reach.
It should take you a matter of seconds, and lucky you, we're going to provide you with those seconds right now, so go to it.
Thank you so much. And now, back to our regularly scheduled programming.
I already mentioned this, but there are no film or television adaptations of this story, which should come as no surprise. It's just so weird to me to read a mystery in which the solving of the clues can only be referred to obliquely. It's very unsatisfying. But as my good friend John Curran notes, many of the ideas contained in this short story were to be used 4 years later. Quoting now from Curran, a snapshot and a dying man's last words, as well as a villainous doctor, are all features of Why Didn't They Ask Evans? And since I have now conceded that Why Didn't They Ask Evans is one of Christie's better thriller novels, I suppose we should be thankful that she tested out some of those plot points in this oddity of an exercise by an author who really did prove over and over again that when it came to the mystery genre, she could do pretty much anything. Is Manx Gold a great short story? No, it's not even a short story. A better question would be, was it successful luring tourists to the Isle of Man to partake of this treasure hunt in June and July of 1930? Tony Medewer does not neglect to address this point. Here's what he has to say in his afterword. It is impossible to judge whether or not Manx Gold was a successful means of promoting tourism to the Isle of Man. Certainly, it appears that there were more visitors in 1930 than in previous years, but how far that increase could be ascribed to the treasure hunt is far from clear. Contemporary press reports show that there were many who doubted that it had been of any real value, and at a civic lunch to mark the end of the hunt, Alderman Crookall responded to a vote of thanks by railing against those who had failed to talk up the hunt. They were slackers and grousers who never did anything but offer criticism. The fact that islanders were not allowed to take part in the hunt may have been a cause of apathy among the islanders, even though the Daily Dispatch offered the Manx resident with whom each finder was staying a prize of 5 guineas, equivalent to about 150 pounds today. That would be 150 pounds in 1997. This may also have accounted for various acts of gentle sabotage, such as the laying of false snuff boxes and spoof clues, including a rock on which the word lift was painted, but under which was nothing more interesting than discarded peel. I love that detail. And I love the idea of grumpy Manx residents annoyed that they couldn't partake of the winnings themselves, refusing to promote the treasure hunt and doing what they could to spoil the proceedings. Beyond Why Didn't They Ask Evans, and this is also a point that Tony Medewer makes, we do, of course, also have Dead Man's Folly, which features Agatha Christie's fictional mystery author, Ariadne Oliver, concocting a sort of treasure hunt or a murder hunt. That is Ariadne Oliver's spin on things. But it's interesting to think of Agatha Christie writing that book several decades after having done something similar earlier in her career. Yet another connection between Agatha and Ariadne. And I suppose we should be thankful that while there may have been some discarded peel and hurt feelings resulting from Agatha Christie's treasure hunt, we had nothing like the fallout from Ariadne Oliver's murder hunt at Nass House. Well, that is Manx Gold by Agatha Christie. I am actually not going to tell you what my next episode is about because I don't want to spoil the surprise, and it does not require any reading ahead of time. That is all I will say. I am so excited to bring it to you. I think you're really going to enjoy it. It's something I've been working on for a bit of time now. Eesh, at this point, I feel like I'm overhyping it. So let's move on. As I mentioned at the top of the episode, I really do love hearing from all of you. So please send me an email at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. Or you can contact the podcast on Twitter at allaboutthedame or on Instagram at allaboutagatha. And I would really love to get some more ratings and reviews. Please, 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 if you haven't yet rated or reviewed the podcast, just take a moment to do it right now. It would mean the world to me. And I'll see you next time. Bye.
If you're in business, you probably have a website, but can your site handle your growth? How many visitors before your site slows down or crashes? What about storage and data security? From web hosting to virtual servers, Pair Networks provides the online infrastructure you need to start, grow, and flourish. When it comes to security and updates, don't worry, we've got you covered. Our 24/7 US-based customer support is the best in the industry. No frustrating chatbots or sitting on hold for hours. Check out pair.com today to learn more. That's PAIR.com.
Ever tried reading while jogging, cooking, or even juggling flaming torches? Yeah, it doesn't end well. But with audiobooks.com, you can conquer books without the circus act. Dive into over 450,000 titles, including more than 10,000 free ones. Get hooked on a bestseller, find your next obsession, or finally read that classic you've been avoiding since high school. And here's the inside scoop. Sign up today for a free 30-day trial and snag your first 3 audiobooks on the house. Sign up for your free trial at audiobooks.com/podcastfree today. That's audiobooks.com/podcastfree.